Jay Rogers. I'm the director of The Forerunner, and I have not done one of these videos on Russia and Ukraine for a couple of weeks, and I just wanted to follow up on it. I've done another article. The last one was called Media Lies on Russia-Ukraine Conflict. This is called Russia-Ukraine Crisis, the Media Wars. So Russia-Ukraine Crisis, the Media Wars. And I have the link to that on the bottom of this video if you want to look at the article. Let me start off by saying I want to clarify something from the outset. I don't justify the war in Ukraine. A lot of my friends and people I've talked to think that I actually justify Vladimir Putin's actions, the war, people being killed, and so on. I don't justify much of what Putin does. I don't also justify much of what the Ukrainian government does either. But I also will say that there's a great truth in some of the things that Putin has stood for in the past, especially in terms of trying to reestablish a Christian worldview as the basis for the culture in Russia, and hopefully for all the nations of the West. The nations of the West have become, especially Western Europe, have become increasingly secular, and that's kind of spreading throughout the world. And I feel that's more of a danger than the autocracy in some Eastern countries. That's my opinion, but it doesn't mean that just because I believe that justifies the war. So Vladimir Putin believes it's not fair to have this unipolar world that's militarily and economically controlled by the United States and then the European NATO powers. He sees that the United States comes to Muslim nations and these Christian African nations and threatens to sanction them unless they go along with our version of neoliberal democracy. And that would include things that are very offensive to Muslims and Christians, like legalizing abortion and same-sex marriage. And I believe that right now what's happening is that we're in this time of a tectonic shift where that neoliberal world is failing and this other multipolar world that's based on civilization is coming into view. One of my favorite podcasts, Dr. Steve Turley, he talks a lot about that. And I just encourage you to look up his videos. So the West wants to turn the moral order of some of these older conservative civilizations upside down. You know, they could be Hindu or Muslim or Christian, but they're morally conservative, and we want to force them into this liberal model. And so you have to look at it objectively as to how do they see it, okay? Most of the countries in the world now see, like 85% of the countries in the world, with the exception of places like Australia and Japan, the United States, and Europe, believe that the center of influence must be multipolar, not just from the West, but all the countries. And so for right now, we should not demonize any of the sides. You know, God might use any country in the world to glorify his name. You know, remember that God used pagan nations to judge Israel in the past, Cyrus and Pharaoh and so on. God even said Cyrus was his servant, and he called him his anointed one. And the word in Hebrew for that is the Messiah. So one of these dictators that we might not like could actually be used of God. Sometimes God doesn't mind using ungodly people so that he can have his way when Christians and his people don't obey him. So I agree with that way of looking at things. I think it's valid to disagree with Putin's action. It's very valid to disagree with the persecution of religious minorities in places like China and Russia to a lesser extent, but certainly there. It's valid to disagree with Muslim extremism and so on. But, to describe him as an autocratic leader and to view the war in Ukraine with disgust and horror is a completely different thing than saying, well, this war was completely unprovoked. They had no reason to go in there. They just invaded a sovereign democracy for no reason. That's not true either. The war has a definite cause, and it's not entirely due to Russian aggression. Part of it resulted from the West's realization that our leaders are losing control over the world economy. And that's been going on for a number of years. And so the West's military might is put out there to try to weaken Russia and to weaken China, so hopefully that their economy can collapse, and then they can break up the country into smaller pieces. The oil companies can move in, and they can colonize different parts of the country that have the oil and so on, much of like what we've done in other countries around the world. So instead of that happening, what's happening instead is the military ability to control the outcome of conflicts around the world has collapsed in the last few years. And it's become very apparent that we failed in Afghanistan, for instance, but also in Syria and Libya and Iraq. And the rest of the world sees that, and they also see that NATO has started these wars that started off to do one thing, but then in the process they killed millions of people, including hundreds of thousands of civilians. And so although most countries in the world will say like, well, we oppose Russia as well, many people in these other nations besides the West see that the conflicts they see that Russia's conflicts are near their borders, and that the casualties in Russia's wars are actually less than what NATO has done in the Middle East. And they see the war in Ukraine as NATO's proxy war in Ukraine. And really what it is, it's a last-ditch battle to try to preserve Western control over the 85% of the world who's now resisting Western dominance. So I see the whole Ukraine conflict as a microcosm of how, God himself is winnowing the nations on a much larger scale, and there's this tectonic shift in influence going on. So in the last article, I gave a list of resources that you can look at as a counter to the legacy media. I consider the legacy media to just be promoting a pack of lies about the war, and not just about the war, but on many other issues. We're constantly told things that, some accusation is a baseless claim, or that this is without merit, or that this is misinformation. And then a year or so later, it comes out that, oh, this happens to be true. That happened with Russia. That happened with Russiagate. It happened with Hunter Biden's laptop. And the media actually censors information. The legacy media censors information that they don't want you to hear, so you can get the correct narrative. All right. So here's some alternate sources that you can go to for another point of view. And I don't endorse every single one of these sources. There are some things I don't agree with. But the first one that I highly recommend is this Ukraine on Fire trilogy. It was done by Oliver Stone. And each one of these 3 films is a masterpiece. It's some of the best documentaries I've ever seen. The first 2 are directed by Oliver Stone. And I find Stone personally, I don't agree with his politics. I think he's a conspiracy theorist. He's definitely very involved in controversy. But I didn't watch it at first because of that. I just thought, well, it's Oliver Stone. I'm probably not going to agree with. But then as the war started, I said, well, maybe I should look at it. And then most of what I saw was basically just well-presented, documented facts. And very good narration. It does a good job at connecting the dots. And I would call this series prophetic because you see how each one of these events led us up to the current crisis. I've heard little bits and pieces of this before. I know most of it because I was a missionary to Russia and Ukraine for over 10 years. I went there on lots of trips. And I know about a lot of these events, but then I saw how it all fit together, which was kind of amazing. So they have some of the videos have some problems. I'll tell you one is I feel like he whitewashes one of the past Ukrainian presidents that he was interviewing. His name is Viktor Yanukovych, and I feel like he was not a good guy, but he's kind of presented as being a little bit more. So you'll notice that there's a little content rating on this. You have to click it because it's mainly because of some of the violent images that surrounded the Euromaidan coup. But if you look at this, some of the graphics in this video are really quite amazing. History doesn't repeat, but how's that? I mean, there's some very clever things in here. There's the Ukrainian flag, for instance. It's just the imagery is chock full of symbolism and really great. way of illustrating what's being talked about. That's the first one.
Ukraine has been the pathway for Western.
And then there's also Revealing Ukraine, which is a follow-up. And then one that was done most recently last year, which was called The Everlasting Present, Ukraine 30 Years of Independence. I put a link to a playlist here. You can see all three. And don't worry about this. This is just, there's a few scenes that are violent. It's actual violence that, it's true to life type of stuff. And you can go to there's the playlist right there. Okay. I have not yet watched Putin's interview. Oliver Stone's interviews with Putin, which is another good one, but I have not watched that yet. And I should have. I've seen parts of it. Parts of it are in these videos. So, last time I mentioned Steve Turley. Like I said, he's the one that really always talks about the multipolar world that's emerging and Christian civilization and so on. The Duran is very good. I listen to that every day. The Gray Zone comes out once a week. It's by some very liberal commentators that nevertheless agree on things with these conservatives, which is kind of interesting. And then Gonzalo Lira is the last one. Since the last time I talked about him, well, basically he's a Chilean-American living in Kharkov. He's married to a Ukrainian woman. And he was doing these podcasts on what was really going on in Ukraine, and he was arrested by Ukraine's secret police, and he was detained for, I think, 6 days. And then he had to sign a release saying that he needed to remain in the city and not discuss what happened during his arrest, and his phone and passwords were confiscated. So he started a new podcast called Gonzalo Lira 2. So people were thinking that he was assassinated because there's other pro-Russian bloggers that have actually been shot by the Ukrainian secret police. And I guess that because this man was an American and the Chilean embassy was contacting them, and the Russians knew about it and the Americans knew about it, so I guess they got a little bit spooked and they set him free. I don't know the whole story, obviously, but he was not treated as harshly by the SBU as people that had been assassinated. So he's now back, and has a new YouTube channel, and he's speaking freely, so that's good. There's some more YouTube podcasts. Ava K. Bartlett and Patrick Lancaster are on the field. Most American and Western journalists are not in the battlefield. They're in Kiev, drinking in bars, and they're just given propaganda, and they feed it back to us. This one by Ava K. Bartlett, she's been on the battlefield for years and years. And the way I started to notice her was she exposed this mass graves hoax. So basically what this is about is that in the media, Ukraine was accused of killing 9,000 Mariupol civilians, civilians, and burying them in mass graves in a cemetery. So what happened was there was some aerial photos of where this was. There was information on where it was. So she was in the area, so she went there to interview. And what she found out was that this is the area that it is right there. And there's a picture of the street. It's kind of interesting. So you can actually see in this video, if you watch it closely, you can see that some of these buildings are actually in the video in the background, which is kind of interesting. And these are the mass graves. These are the mass graves of 9,000 civilians. There's actually a few hundred, and some of them are killed in the war, and some of them are people that were killed prior to the war. Because there's been this, there's been, and some of the people are elderly too, which is the other thing that's interesting. So that you can watch this, it's very good. And she interviews some of the grave diggers who are responsible for. We bury people who were brought from Mariupol. Both are for civil population. Everyone's buried under numbers. Some people have names, right? So they can identify them later, right? Some of them have names that were put on the plates. And everyone was buried in separate graves, not in mass graves, and in coffins. and they say, "May I ask you a question?" Oops, I should get out of that. So 30 by 90 meters, which is huge. It's like, 1/3 of a football field, essentially. So it's better if you watch this yourself. You can see it larger. But basically, they're saying, look, they're all buried in separate graves. There's nowhere near 9,000. But that's literally what they do is they take the propaganda from Kiev, basically. Whoever is doing the public relations, and they just print it like they say it, and no one checks into it. No one goes there. Here's a guy who is fantastic. This guy has been doing war correspondence from Donbass and other areas too, like Armenia and other places in the area that have wars going on. He has hundreds of reports, eyewitness views, uncut interviews, and you can see multiple testimonies from locals in other cities who blame Ukraine for shelling the homes in Mariupol, as Ukraine has been doing for 8 years. So what people don't realize is that, a lot of what goes on in these places has been going on for 8 years in Donbass. And the people who were fighting in Mariupol, most of them were actually... Let me see if I can show this interview here.
Like, subscribe, and share. We're out of here.
There was some actual What's amazing about these videos is there's actual shooting and rockets going on sometimes. So he goes right into the battle zones and talks to people. Let me see if I can find this.
Военные объекты здесь? Да. Нет. Ну почему украинские стреляют здесь?
Вы понимаете, они как бы стреляют, им все равно куда стрелять. Им нет разницы, куда стрелять. Они запугивают население. Они бьют во все, просто по живому массиву.
So we hear that, there is Russian bombs falling on Mariupol, which did happen, obviously. But they're saying that, these are people that are part of the Nazi battalion, and they've been in Mariupol for 8 years, and they've been firing back at the Russians, but also firing at civilians, because they hate the Russians, right? Because some of them are from Western Ukraine, they're Nazis, so we don't hear about this in the media, or they mock it.
What the locals here are saying. I was on the road coming back from Mariupol. We just saw this.
So I'd say definitely watch this guy. I mean, he has some very, very good. This is his channel right here, and all of these are great. There is one. Let's see, which one is it? These are all very recent, last few weeks in Mariupol, but these go back. If you really, he was also in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is part of Armenia within Azerbaijan. There's a civil war there going on. So people don't get, this is not something that started in February. This is something that's been going on in the Soviet Union really since before 1991, these different ethnic conflicts. And basically what Russia is doing now is trying to liberate these people from people that were basically just occupying their cities and holding civilians as human shields and so on. If you don't believe it, watch the videos, see for yourself. The two members of the Duran that I recommended last time have their own video channels. We have Alexander Christoforou. He's the producer. He's a Greek American living in Cyprus, and he does at least one video every day. And he's he's very anti-Ukrainian, pro-Russian. But he gives like the other side of the story. He does his research and gives a little talk every morning from Cyprus. And then in the afternoon, he gets together with Alexander, who's living in London, and they do a little podcast on the air. And this guy here is one of the best, most informed, articulate people on the war that I've heard. He does his research. He'll tell you, if he's not an expert on the subject, he doesn't give his opinion. He just says, some people say this, but then they interview an expert on the Duran and so on. So they kind of give like what the Western media is saying.
Today remains a holiday period in Russia and to some extent in Ukraine.
So he's very demure and very articulate guy. I like him. Colonel McGregor, it's not his channel, it's a fan channel, and they try to collect many of the they haven't done one in a while, but I know he's been on shows constantly, but he was an advisor to Trump, okay, and he was also very frequently featured on Tucker Carlson. He's one of the voices on the war in Ukraine. He's giving factual information, true information, very it's very good analysis of what's actually happening. You always hear, Ukraine's winning and so on. He'll tell you the opposite. George Galloway is another guy. He does something called what's it called? The Mother of All Talk Shows, where he interviews different people. And he covers everything. There's all different types of politics and world events, but obviously Ukraine is a big part of his show, so I would recommend him as well. I kind of put these in the order of how much I like them. And I watch certain ones more than the others, but there are some that I think are just better, and so I put those up on the top. This is Earl Grey. He is he's a British citizen living in St. Petersburg, so he's also pro-Russian. All right. But he's very fair, I think. He tries to just cover the news and what's going on from that part of the world. Redacted, Clayton Morris and his wife. What's his wife's name? Clayton and Natalie. Okay. And very professional show. Some of these are amateur looking. This one's very professional looking. I really liked this one right here. This was very good. This was on, are there actual Nazis in Ukraine? Because I hear that every day. Like there's some media person who are mocking the fact that Putin and Lavrov are talking about the Nazis in Ukraine. They say, how can they be Nazis in Ukraine? That's ridiculous. But they did this 45-minute show where they just went through and documented all the different let me see.
Russia's death toll likely outpaces that of Ukrainian military personnel.
That's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something specific.
About 2,500 to 3,000.
Released a video showing a medical point, a hospital.
They're showing the different hoaxes that go on. This is this the one about the Nazis I'm trying to find? There's one that's very good where they have John McCain and if you're trying to remember the name of the other senator from South Carolina, they're actually in Ukraine talking to the Nazis and saying, we're going to get you more weapons and so on. And there are people from the Azov battalion right there. And McCain and Lindsey Graham are there talking to them about how, they're going to get them more weapons. The funny thing about it was that this is it right here. I just clicked on the wrong video. Let's see if I can find this real quick. There we go, right there. This is Poroshenko with Lindsey Graham and John McCain. And they're standing with people who are part of the Azov battalion. They didn't know that. They thought these are just Ukrainian soldiers, but they're saying that, don't worry, when the new administration comes in. They were thinking it was going to be Clinton. They didn't know that Trump was going to be elected. But they're saying, we're going to get you all the weapons that you need to fight Russia. Which is kind of funny because these people in our government believe that the United States is fighting Russia through Ukraine as a proxy in order to weaken Russia so we can destroy their economy and take them over, basically. All right, this is the dive with Jackson Hinkle. Very well done. He's not the most original guy. He basically does a mashup of different other people that are, different other shows. And usually he does this long podcast. And then he does a shorter one, like little clips from the longer one that he does. And he throws in graphics and things like that. He does a pretty good job on it. And he's not as articulate as some of the other ones I pointed out, but he's very polished. And he, like I said, he does a mashup of the highlights of some of the other podcasts. This is international media. I feel like this is very important because each country has their own bias. Like we have our own bias in America, Russia has its bias, Ukraine has its bias, but what does the foreign ministry of Russia say? What does Lavrov say every day? And Lavrov has these, not every day, but he has these very frequent releases where he talks directly to the press and gives the Russian view. And these are all with subtitles, I believe. Oh, I guess not all were with subtitles. Some of them are with English subtitles, so you have to kind of... Oh, here's the one. You can click on the ones with English. This is very good. His interview with India Today is excellent. I would watch that on India Today, though, because the video is better. But he basically is just giving... And we never hear from Lavrov or Putin, but we hear from Zelensky. So we never actually hear what they're saying, except just for some very filtered sound bites. Okay. Shanghai Eye is very good. It's a mainland Chinese. Now, these are the Chinese communists, but it's good to look at what is their view on world events. And obviously not all of this is on Russia, Ukraine, but, quite a bit of it is. So if you go under the videos, you'll hear news that you won't hear from the West. And they're somewhat sympathetic to Russia, but not entirely. So you kind of get more of a balance, and more of so there's some objectivity in here. It's kind of interesting that China has one of the highest abortion rates in the world. Here's their view on the abortion ruling. Okay. And it's not what you think. I mean, it's like we have these caricatures of other countries, and they're not nearly what you think that they are. India Today is very good. And again, India is an ally of Russia, and they are very concerned about the war, and they're concerned about NATO aggression. What I love is to watch the live stream of this sometimes, and just, when they're talking about Russia, look at the chat. There's a little live chat going on. And you see, like, the entire world is not united around Russia. Some people are anti-Russia, some people are anti-Zelensky, but most people are anti-NATO because they've seen what NATO has done in the Middle East, and they blame NATO for the war in Ukraine. Okay, and this is from there's stuff from all over the world, but there's quite a bit of news from Ukraine. Modi is doing a tour right now, so a lot of this is about Modi at the moment. But you'll get the Indian point of view. Okay. Then we have, this is from South America, and these are the socialist governments of South America, like Mexico and Cuba and Venezuela and I think one other one, I forget which one it is, but this is propaganda. This is communist propaganda. But again, it's interesting to see how they treat the Ukraine war. Very different point of view than what you get from American. I'm trying to look for one in here. I guess a lot of this news is dying down. It's becoming, unfortunately, So, for instance, you'll get this. This is all in English, by the way, too. It's not in Spanish. So I'm trying to include channels that are in English.
Kherson were attacked on April 27th with Tosha-U tactical ballistic missile systems and with multiple rocket.
And so you'll get news from you'll get news from Russia that you won't get on American television, but other countries are seeing news from Russia. We have censored it. YouTube blocked Russia Today, for instance, but you can still get the information that's on those channels from. Here's one right here. Looks interesting. Anyway, I'm not going to belabor this. You can look. That's not one of my favorite ones, by the way. This one is also from India. It's anti-Russian. It's anti... How do I want to put this? It's anti-Russian. It's anti-American. Anti-Western. It's an Indian nationalist channel. And they do pretty good in-depth summaries. It sounds like an oxymoron, but it's summarized, and yet it does go into a little bit more depth than you get in our American sound bites, in other words. some pretty good analysis of things that are going on. They analyze the propaganda a little bit. And they're a little bit sensationalistic, as you can see by looking at this. But it's good to get another perspective, like I said. Cyrus Jansen is, first of all, who is he? He's an American. He's fluent in Mandarin. He's lived in China. He's lived in, he does videos in both English and Chinese. And he's trying to help people understand China and improve the relationship between East and West. So he has some very interesting Chinese perspective. What do people in China think about? Will Taiwan be the next Ukraine? That type of thing. What's going on with, right? Is America and NATO responsible for the Russia-Ukraine war? And then what he does...
The United States is the most warlike nation in the world. And there's one question that many people around the globe have right now. Is this Russian...
Very good analysis, very well done, very good graphics.
Of the United States and the ever-expanding NATO military.
And he just does this all himself. I guess he's crowdfunded and so on.
In 1991, NATO has expanded eastward no less than 5 times. Currently, there are 3 NATO...
So very, very good coverage of... from an alternative point of view. I love this one. This is one of the ones I think is fantastic. This is an independent group called Asian Boss. And what they do is they go around and they interview people all over Asia, from Turkey to the Philippines to Japan, Shanghai, everywhere. And they ask people on the streets, what do they think? You know, like, do you think that, they ask people in Taiwan, do you think that, China is going to try to take Taiwan? Right. What do the Chinese think of the Russians and so on?
Hey everybody, it's Stephen from Asian Boss. So, whenever we talk about our mission to bridge cultural gaps between Asia and the West, we often emphasize that we do all this to prevent World War III, and people laugh at us. Well, I hope you're not laughing now, as the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues to unfold.
So they just asked different people in China, like, what do you think about Russia? And it's one of the things that's really amazing is most of these people are fairly young. They have a lot of knowledge about what's going on in the world. You think that these people are very isolated and they don't know what's going on in the media? No, they know more than Americans do. So that's another thing that the media lies to us about, is that we get more propaganda and less objective stuff. These people are actually very thoughtful, and their opinions are all over the map, while we tend to be very monolithic because we're just fed this. Anyway, I'm going to get on my horse here. Okay, and then the 2 books I've been reading, one of them is very good. It's called Clash of Civilizations. Have not really gotten too much into that one yet. But this is this whole idea of that. This was written back in 1996, and there's been this idea since, I think I don't know how long it's been around, but there is an idea that there is a nation state which has been the predominant political order in the West since the Middle Ages, since the end of the 30 Years' War, after the Reformation. And then now we're entering into another era that's no longer the nation state, but the civilization state. And this goes into detail and describes what this is. And these are the different civilizations. There'd be like a Brazilian civilization, or maybe like an entire Hispanic civilization. I think that the United States would be a separate civilization, and that Europe would be not a civilization state because there's too many civilizations there. But that these other countries like China and Russia and the Muslim countries and the sub-Saharan African Christian countries, India, these are all, like in other words, they're very ancient countries based on traditional values, traditional faiths. So you have, like, Hinduism goes back thousands of years, Buddhism goes back thousands of years, Islam goes back about 1,400 years, Christianity 2,000 years, and so there are these cultures, civilization states that have been around for a long time, but they were co-opted recently by nation states, and then more recently by neoliberalism, which is a Western liberal form of democracy. And we try to make every country conform to our own form of democracy. And they don't like that. They don't like it in Africa when you come and tell them that they have to restrict their population and have small families and abort their children and accept same-sex marriage and transgender. This is just horrifying to them, you know? And so there's a lot of things in Africa that we don't like that are wrong, but there's a lot of things that the United States says that are wrong too. So the idea of civilization states is basically we're going to leave each other alone and let these countries emerge and turn into great civilizations. This man I told you I absolutely love, this is Dr. Steve Turley. He's a teacher like me. He actually went full-time to become a podcaster, which is something I have done before. I've gone full-time to do Christian media. And he has this wonderful series of books. This is the one I'm reading right now. The Rise of Christendom and the New Christian Majority. And he points to countries where this is happening. You know, one thing I would say about Russia and Ukraine, I don't take sides on this. I think that Ukraine has a fantastic Ukrainian nationalist culture. I mean, Ukraine is basic. A lot of Ukraine is very similar to Russian culture, but in the West, they've always been very nationalistic. I'm not against that because they're very conservative and they're Christians. You know, there tend to be more Catholics in that area and among the Orthodox as well, whereas in Eastern Russia, they're more Orthodox. But, I mean, Eastern Ukraine, they're more Orthodox and they're Russian. So, you know, I don't take sides on who, like, the one thing that I agree on is I think that the UN has failed to prevent war in the world. And the reason why they failed is that they try to force. The West has used NATO to try to force Western liberal democracy on nations, and that's just not going to work. So the rest of this article you can read, and there's a little, not a defense of Russia's war, but an explanation of why they're at war. Like for instance, right after Poroshenko was elected, he said this, which is kind of interesting.
У нас пенсії будуть, у них немає. У нас піклування під людей, під пенсіонерів, під дітей буде, у них немає. У нас діти підуть до школи, до дитячих садків, у них вони будуть сидіти в підвалах. Бо вони нічого не вміють робити. І так, і саме так ми виграємо цю війну.
So this is 2014. That's when the war started. And the reason why you have such animosity now is you have people like this guy saying that, you know, unless the Russians come back into Ukrainian society and assimilate and learn to speak Ukrainian and go to Ukrainian schools, they're not going to have jobs in schools and they're just going to have to sit in their basements. And meanwhile, they're bombing them, you know, so that's, people don't look at that side of it. So I have a long explanation of this, what's going on. And here's a little thing on, I'm going to write a lot more on this multipolar shift in geopolitics, but, this is how I came to this view. Here's the last thing I want to show you is that this is a real thing, people. This is what the West's vision for Russia is. They would like to break up Russia and take all of the oil and mineral resources in Ural and Siberia. The way they would break up Russia is not militarily. It would be weakening the economy through sanctions, and then encouraging ethnic uprisings. Like, people in Ural aren't going to want to be governed by Moscow if the economy is horrible and they have all these resources. They might as well work with Western corporations that would come in and build oil refineries and things like that, and enrich, because a lot of the wealth comes from this area, but it's administrated by Moscow. So that's the idea, is to try to like turn Ural and Siberia against Moscow. Also, the Tatars, who are Muslims, turn them against Moscow, turn the different ethnic groups like Chechnya and Dagestan and Gush, whatever, all these. But I have a friend who's actually Ossetian, and he was telling me about that nation. It's quite amazing. It's a Christian country, and many of these countries are either Muslim or Christian, but they're along the border of Russia, and they're part of Russia. That's what the whole Georgian war was about. It was about ethnic groups that wanted to be separate from Georgia, and they appeal. Anyway, I'll get into that another point. But and then Karelia was taken from Finland. Now, the same thing could be said about Ukraine. We could say that like Western Ukraine actually belonged to Hungary, Romania, and Poland, and that many of the cities in Western Ukraine are actually Polish. And they were part of Poland for a long time, or Hungary, or that type of thing. That's the reason why the Nazism arose in that area, was because of the Austro-Hungarian axis that was with Germany in World War I, kind of extended into that area in World War II. And Ukraine was not, Ukraine and Belarusia was actually parts of Ukraine and Belarus was part of Poland at that time. I can show you another map. Let's see if I can find this real quick without taking too much time. There was a recent, I'll get into this in another video, but there is an actual plan, see if I can find it, to break Ukraine up, give part of it back to Poland. Yeah, this would be the idea. Is this part right here would go to Russia. This part would go to Romania. I don't think this part would go to Romania, but there's these different, these are like these different, like this, they're saying this is really Poland, this is really Hungary, this is really Romania. And it was, not that long ago, in the 20th century, it was like that. Ukraine would become this little rump state, and then all the Russians living around the border would either secede to Russia or they'd form their own republic. So that's another plan. And it shouldn't have to be that way. The way it should be is that there should be a Christian civilization, and in their country it would be based on orthodoxy, Russian Orthodox Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church, and then allowing, evangelicals and other groups that can live peacefully within that system, within that civilization, to also, be able to have an impact on the society, that type of thing. That's what I would want to see in Ukraine, and this could have all been avoided, I think, except for this whole idea of NATO wanting to force our way of life on people. So that's my screed here. Let me see if I can get out of this. Okay, thank you for listening. I know this has been a really long one, but I will see you on the next video. And subscribe to my channel if you've listened this far. Like this video and go to the Forerunner, forerunner.com. If you type in the Forerunner, you might find it, but forerunner.com is the URL.